Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the single greatest threat to America's long term prosperity isn't an external enemy, but a number that grows by billions of dollars every single day? And what if that number, a national IOU, has just crossed a threshold that was once considered purely hypothetical? To begin, let's set the stage with the current situation. The fiscal landscape of the United States has just crossed a new, deeply sobering threshold. The nation's gross national debt has now officially surpassed the staggering sum of $38 trillion. This figure for an entire generation has been an abstract warning, a problem for the distant future. That future has arrived. This is not merely an accounting entry. It represents a tangible per capita burden that, when distributed among the populace, equates to somewhere between $100,000 and $111,000 for every single man, woman, and child in the country. It is a mortgage held against the future prosperity of every citizen, a debt incurred in their name but largely without their direct consent. What is perhaps more alarming than this absolute number is the sheer velocity of its growth. The debt has demonstrated an accelerative quality that defies historical precedent. In a recent stunning period, the debt ballooned by $1 trillion in just 82 days. To put this in perspective, that is less than 3 months a single fiscal quarter to accumulate a sum that was once the entire national debt. This breakneck speed transforms the problem from a chronic issue into an acute crisis. We are no longer discussing a slow leak, we are discussing a hemorrhage. The primary concern, as voiced by economists and fiscal watchdogs, is no longer just the absolute value of the debt, but the accelerating trend of its accumulation. This escalation makes one fact painfully clear. This is not a temporary spike. It is not the predictable short-term result of a specific crisis, such as a major war or a deep cyclical recession, after which a return to fiscal normalcy could be expected. Instead, the United States is facing a deep structural problem. The deficit, the gap between what the government spends and what it collects, has become baked into the very fabric of the American political and economic system. It is a feature, not a bug, of modern governance. This grim assessment is not hyperbole. It is the official projection of the nation's own fiscal scorekeeper, the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO. The CBO's long-term outlook does not predict a stabilization or a correction. On the contrary, it projects that the debt will continue its relentless climb for decades to come, far surpassing any previously recorded level relative to the size of the economy. This trajectory suggests a fundamental misalignment between the promises the government has made to its citizens and the revenue it is willing or able to collect to pay for them. The $38 trillion milestone is not a peak. It is a base camp on the dollar's way to even more treacherous heights. This leads to a critical question. How did this financial chasm even get created? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the simple yet often obscured mechanics of government finance. The national debt is the cumulative result of this misalignment. It is the grand total, the running balance of every dollar the United States government has borrowed throughout its history. It represents the sum of all past annual deficits plus the compounding interest owed to the creditors who lent the money. These creditors are both domestic and foreign. In the simplest terms, the federal government has been operating like a household with a credit card, consistently spending more than it earns for decades. The $38 trillion figure is the outstanding balance on that credit card. The engine driving this accumulation is the annual deficit. This is the one-year shortfall. The government, it is important to note, operates on a fiscal year that ends on September 30th, not on the calendar year. A deficit occurs when within that fiscal year, total spending, known as outlays, exceeds total revenue, known as receipts. The historical context for this is stark. The last time the United States government ran a surplus, a year where it actually earned more than it spent, was in 2001. For over 2 decades, the government has failed to balance its books even a single time, borrowing money year after year to cover the difference. Regardless of which political party controlled the White House or Congress, the fiscal year 2025 serves as a perfect and troubling case study of this mechanism in action. During that period, the federal government collected approximately $5.23 trillion in total revenue. However, its total spending amounted to approximately $7.01 trillion. The math is simple and unforgiving. This created an annual deficit of approximately $1.78 trillion. This shortfall, this gap, did not simply vanish. To cover its expenses, the government had to borrow that entire $1.78 trillion, which was then added directly to the principal of the national debt, pushing it past the $38 trillion mark. The interest on the debt now exceeds the defense budget. Method for this borrowing is the sale of government bonds, universally known as treasuries. When the U.S. Treasury needs to raise cash to pay for this deficit spending, it essentially sells IUS. Investors, which include individuals, large pension funds, corporations, and foreign governments, loan their money to the U.S. government. In return, they receive a treasury bond, which is a promise from the government to repay that loan with interest at a specified future date known as the maturity date. This system, long considered the bedrock of the global financial system due to its perceived safety, is the very mechanism that facilitates America's chronic overspending. So let's break that down further. Where is all this money coming from and where is it going? That $1.78 trillion deficit for fiscal year 2025 isn't an abstract failure. It's the direct result of specific, identifiable choices in the federal budget. The story of the debt is a story of where the money comes from and, far more importantly, where it goes. First, let's examine federal revenue. The $5.23 trillion the government collected, the vast majority of this income is derived directly from the public and the workforce. The largest single source, accounting for approximately 51.7% of all revenue, is individual income taxes. The second largest source, at 34.2%, comes from FICA taxes, the payroll taxes designated for Social Security and Medicare. Combined, these two sources account for the lion's share of all government income. By stark contrast, corporate income taxes contribute a much smaller portion, approximately 9.4%. The remainder is filled in by customs duties on imports, excise taxes on specific goods, and estate or gift taxes. Next, we must analyze federal spending, the $7.01 trillion in outlays. This side of the ledger is dominated by what is known as mandatory spending. These are expenses that are effectively on autopilot, required by existing laws rather than by annual votes in Congress. The largest of these expenses are the nation's primary social safety net programs, Social Security with outlays of approximately $1.5 trillion in healthcare programs, chiefly Medicare for seniors and Medicaid for low-income individuals. Following these entitlements is national defense. The defense budget at approximately $917 billion in fiscal year 2025 represents a massive discretionary expense, though one that is rarely subject to significant cuts. But a new critical threshold has been crossed, one that fiscal experts have warned about for decades. For the first time, the fastest growing and one of the largest single expenses in the federal budget is interest on the debt. In fiscal year 2025, the government spent approximately $970 billion on this line item. This is a crucial, terrifying development. The United States is now spending more money on interest payments, money that buys no new services, builds no roads, funds no research, and pays no soldiers than it does on its entire national defense budget. This interest expense now consumes approximately 18.5% of all incoming tax revenue. This means that for every dollar a citizen pays in taxes, nearly 19 cents does not go to funding the government. It goes directly to creditors to service the debt accumulated in previous years. The rest of the budget is filled with other categories such as income security programs like SNAP, food stamps, and benefits for veterans. But these are dwarfed by the massive outlays for entitlements, defense, and now the crippling cost of interest. Now, this brings us to a concept you may have heard about, the debt spiral, which is really a crisis of rising interest rates. You see, for many years, the government was able to manage this growing debt load because of one single massive advantage, historically low interest rates. But that era has come to an abrupt and painful end, introducing the most dangerous accelerant to the nation's fiscal crisis. The new challenge began as a response to a different crisis, rampant inflation. To cool down the overheating economy, the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, which operates independently of the government, embarked on an aggressive campaign to raise interest rates. It lifted its benchmark rate from near zero to over 5% in a very short period. While the Federal Reserve's job is to manage inflation and employment, its actions have catastrophic side effects for a government that is $38 trillion in debt. The mechanism that triggers the spiral is known as rolling over the debt. Government bonds are not permanent. They have maturity dates. A 2-year bond sold in 2021, for example, came due in 2023. But because the government is running a deficit, it does not have the cash on hand to pay back the bonzo, investor who holds that mature bond. Its solution is simple. It rolls the debt over by issuing a new bond to raise the cash needed to pay off the old one. Herein lies the trap. The 2-year bond sold in 2021 might have been issued at an interest rate of 1% or less. But the new bond being sold in 2023 to replace it must be financed at the new current market rate of over 5%. The government's cost of borrowing has multiplied not just on new debt, but on all the old debt that must be refinanced. This creates the vicious feedback loop known as the debt spiral. The process is the debt spiral trap. How high rates fuel the crisis as follows. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates to fight inflation. These higher rates dramatically increase the cost of the government's interest payments as it rolls over old, cheap debt into new expensive debt. These exploding interest payments, the $970 billion line item, increased total federal spending. Increased spending with no new revenue widens the process. Annual deficit. The $1.78 trillion gap gets even bigger. A wider deficit forces the government to borrow even more money, all at the new high interest rates. This in turn adds to the total debt principal, which in turn generates even higher interest payments in the future. The debt is now feeding on itself. The interest is compounding, and the government is borrowing money just to pay the interest on money it has already borrowed. This is a classic sovereign debt trap, a cycle that becomes exponentially more difficult to escape with each passing year. So, who exactly owns all this debt? We're talking about $38 trillion. This is a question I get all the time, and the answer usually surprises people. There's a pervasive myth that it's primarily owed to foreign rivals, most notably China. While foreign ownership is a component, the reality is far more complex. In fact, only about 25% of the U.S. national debt is held by foreign nations. The uncomfortable truth is that the largest creditor to the United States is, in fact, the United States itself. Looking first at the 25% held externally, the largest single foreign creditor is Japan. For years, Japan's economy and pension funds have been a stable source of demand for U.S. treasuries. China is also a major holder, though its share has been steadily decreasing in recent years as its own currency. The yuan strengthens and it seeks to diversify its holdings away from the US dollar. The United Kingdom is another significant holder, its own economy deeply intertwined with that of the US. However, a large portion of what is classified as foreign debt is held in financial hubs. Nations like Belgium, home to the massive securities clearinghouse Euroclear, Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, and Ireland, appear as massive creditors. This debt is generally not held by the citizens of those small countries, but rather by international corporations, hedge funds, and other financial institutions that use these nations as financial centers, often as tax havens. The vast majority of the debt, the remaining 75%, is held domestically. This domestic debt is broadly split into two categories. The first is intergovernmental holdings. This is money the government essentially owes to itself. The largest single creditor of the United States is the Social Security Trust Fund. For decades, the Social Security program collected more in payroll taxes than it paid out in benefits. By law, that surplus revenue was invested in special U.S. Treasury bonds. In reality, the cash was taken by the government and spent on other things from wars to highways, and the Social Security Trust Fund was given an IOU. This internal accounting now represents a massive liability, as Social Security is now paying out more than it takes in and must begin redeeming those IUS. The second category is public holdings. This is debt held by American entities outside the federal government. A massive owner is the U.S. Federal Reserve itself, which buys and sells treasury bonds as its primary tool for managing the money supply. Beyond the Fed, the debt is held by the pillars of the U.S. financial system, U.S. banks, private pension funds, which manage your retirement money, insurance companies, mutual funds, and state and local governments. This means the stability of the entire American financial system, from your retirement account to your bank solvency, is inextricably linked to the perceived stability and value of this government debt. This, of course, leads to the most important question. How does this actually affect you? What are the real consequences for the economy and for the public? The fact is, This $38 trillion debt is not a victimless abstraction. Its consequences are filtering down from the macroeconomy directly into the daily lives of ordinary people. The most immediate and painful impact is the higher cost of borrowing for citizens. There is a spillover effect. When the U.S. government, considered the safest borrower in the world, must pay over 5% interest to borrow money, no private bank will lend money to a citizen for less. This directly translates into the soaring interest rates seen on mortgages, which have locked millions of potential buyers out of the housing market. It is the reason car loan payments have become more expensive and why credit card interest rates APRs have risen to crippling double-digit levels. This high interest rate environment, driven by government borrowing and the Fed's response, creates a powerful headwind for the geopolitical threat, de-dollarization, and the exorbitant privilege, the entire economy leading to economic stagnation. For businesses, the cost of borrowing money to build a new factory, invest in research, or hire new workers becomes prohibitive. This stifles innovation and expansion, leading to fewer new jobs and, in some cases, layoffs for workers. This environment is the primary driver of stagnant wage growth. Even if an employee receives a raise, it is often erased by inflation, which is itself a potential consequence of the same government spending and borrowing. The risk of devaluation and inflation is the shadow that hangs over this entire scenario. When a government borrows this heavily, it risks devaluing its own currency over time. If investors begin to fear that the U.S. will be unable to pay its debts, they will demand even higher interest rates, or worse, the government might be tempted to print money. A process called quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve buys the debt to pay its bills. This infusion of new money without a corresponding increase in economic output is the classic recipe for inflation, which erodes the purchasing power of every paycheck and every dollar held in savings. Finally, there is the long-term systemic risk, a loss of global confidence. For decades, the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency, and U.S. Treasury bonds have been seen as risk-free. This status is not guaranteed. Credit rating agencies such as Moody's have already issued downgrades and negative outlooks on U.S. debt, signaling new risk. This is the financial equivalent of a personal credit score being cut. It makes all future borrowing even more expensive, further reinforcing the debt spiral. An unchecked rise in the debt risks a catastrophic fiscal crisis, a scenario in which investors dump U.S. bonds, the dollar crashes, and the U.S. loses its position as the anchor of the global economy, a possibility that until recently was considered unthinkable. But the domestic consequences, while severe, are actually intertwined with an even larger geopolitical threat. We need to talk about the geopolitical framework because the U.S. dollar's dominance is truly at risk. This special status, held since the Bretton Woods Agreement near the end of World War II, is arguably the single most valuable asset the United States possesses. It is the bedrock of its global power and has provided what has been termed an exorbitant privilege. This privilege means that the U.S. dollar is the default currency for international trade. Critical commodities, most notably oil, are priced and settled in dollars globally. Furthermore, central banks from every other nation on earth hold U.S. dollars and U.S. Treasury bonds as their primary risk-free foreign exchange reserves. This global demand for dollars and treasuries is the secret ingredient that has enabled the $38 trillion debt to accumulate without triggering the hyperinflation or fiscal collapse that would have afflicted any other nation. The United States has been able to finance its massive deficits by borrowing in its own currency, a currency the rest of the world needed to buy, both for trade and as a store of value. In essence, the world's central banks have been lending America the money it needs to fund its overspending. This symbiotic relationship, however, is now under immense strain. The $38 trillion question is, what happens when the world's confidence in the risk-free nature of U.S. debt begins to crack? The chronic structural deficits combined with the recurring political brinkmanship of debt ceiling standoffs have led global partners and rivals alike to question the long-term stability of the U.S. fiscal house. They see a nation seemingly unwilling to make the hard choices to govern itself, and they are beginning slowly but surely to hedge their bets. This has given rise to the dollarization movement. Geopolitical rivals such as China and Russia are actively promoting the use of their own currencies in bilateral trade. Blocs of nations such as the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are openly discussing the creation of new payment systems and even alternative reserve assets to bypass the dollar-denominated financial system. This is not a fast process. The US dollar's dominance is built on a massive liquid financial infrastructure that has no immediate rival. The euro has its own structural problems, and the Chinese yuan is not freely convertible or trusted. However, a sudden collapse is not the primary risk. The threat is a slow structural erosion. If demand for U.S. Treasuries, the political catch-22, why there is no easy way out, begins to wane, the consequences would be catastrophic and self-reinforcing. To attract diminishing global investment, the U.S. Treasury would be forced to offer even higher interest rates, which would pour gasoline on the fire of the domestic debt spiral. The United States would lose its exorbitant privilege. It would lose the ability to finance its deficits cheaply. A significant flight from the dollar by central banks would cause its value to plummet, importing massive inflation as the cost of all foreign goods sources. The national debt, therefore, is no longer a purely domestic economic issue. It is a direct and pressing threat to America's fundamental geopolitical standing. So if the problem is this clear and the consequences are this severe, it leads to the logical question everyone asks. Why doesn't the government just fix it? This brings us to the political dilemma and the so-called solutions. The answer lies in a political dilemma where every possible solution is considered more toxic than the problem itself. There are only two ways to fix a deficit: cut spending or raise revenue. First, consider cutting spending. This is politically radioactive because the largest items in the budget are also the most popular. Social Security and Medicare are considered the third rail of American politics. Touch them, and your political career dies. Any attempt to cut benefits for the 72 million or more Americans who depend on these programs, many of whom are senior citizens who vote reliably, is seen as political suicide. The other major expenses, defense and interest, are similarly protected. Second, consider raising revenue. This is, of course, a euphemism for raising taxes. This option is equally unpopular. Neither party wants to be responsible for significantly raising individual income taxes or corporate taxes, fearing backlash from voters and donors. Faced with these two unpopular choices, The political reality for decades has been to choose neither. The path of least resistance, favored by both Republicans and Democrats, is to continue overspending, funding popular programs and tax cuts with borrowed money, and pushing the consequences onto the next generation. The national debt has grown dramatically under presidents from both parties, demonstrating a bipartisan failure of fiscal responsibility. This political paralysis has led some to wonder if there is a cheat code, a way out that avoids the hard choices. This theoretical solution is inflating the debt away. The theory works like this: the government borrows 38 trillion of today's dollars. It then encourages or allows high inflation to run for decades. This inflation, while painful for the public, devalues the currency. Years later, the government pays back its old fixed rate debt with new future dollars that are worth significantly less. This is not just a theory. The US successfully used this exact strategy to reduce its massive debt to GDP ratio after World War II. To understand it, consider the analogy of a 1,970 mortgage. A person who took out a $24,000 mortgage in 1970 was taking on a massive financial burden, as the average salary was a fraction of that. Today, that same $24,000 loan balance would seem trivial, perhaps half of a single year's salary, and could be paid off with ease. The debt amount didn't change, but the value of the money used to pay it shrank dramatically due to inflation. The modern problem with this solution is that we have just experienced its devastating cost. The high inflation of recent years was this process in action. It was so economically and socially painful, eroding savings and crippling households, that the Federal Reserve was forced to intervene. By raising interest rates to fight inflation, the Fed effectively shut down this cheat code. This creates the ultimate catch-22. The act of inflating the debt away causes so much pain that it forces the central bank to raise interest rates, and those high interest rates in turn accelerate the debt spiral, making the underlying debt problem even worse. Ultimately, there is no secret escape. The only sustainable solution is smart, responsible fiscal policy that directly addresses and reduces the annual deficit. This is not impossible. Other modern nations, such as Australia, have recently demonstrated that it is possible to run a budget surplus, collecting more than is spent. A surplus provides choices: paying down debt, investing in infrastructure, or offering tax cuts that are fully paid for. The $38 trillion milestone is not the disease, it is the fever. The disease is a structural deficit born from decades of political unwillingness to align spending with revenue. This disease is now in a new acute phase, accelerated by a compounding debt spiral. The path forward requires political courage and a willingness to make difficult choices that leaders for a generation have found it easier to avoid. Right